People lose so much by making their way without stopping in the streets and squares of their city, noticing almost nothing in their daily rush. But a little time will pass and everything will change. And many people will most likely regret the fact that they didn't look back, did not stop to remember what a square looks like on a warm autumn day, what color the leaves on the old maple are, or hear how an old tram rings. All of this will soon be history. Podil has always been a densely populated part of Kyiv. It was favored by artisans for a long time. There were permanent coaching inns and the city's main market. The heart of Podil was the so-called Torzhiще, or contracts. Here deals were made, lively trading took place, and the Kyiv Vicha gathered. And the border passed along the two walled streets.
Во-первых, она известна как Вечевая. Административная функция там сохранялась на...
First, it is known as Vicha Square. Administrative functions have been preserved there for many centuries. We know that the Pyrohoshcha Dormition of the Mother of God Church was even a tax collection point. The magistrate, in which the function of self-government was exercised, was nearby. Then, after the magistrate was liquidated, one of the buildings was used as the Kyiv Duma for some time. This was in the 19th century, until the construction of the Duma on Khreshchatyk and the appearance of Duma Square itself. All this was located on Kontraktova Square. Every building that is there is a bearer of invaluable information about how and what has evolved. It's a unique place. Political, economic, cultural, religious life, all of it was centered there. The core around which the life of the whole city has been shaped for centuries.
Все это находится на одной площади. Вот то ядро, вокруг которого фактически формировалась жизнь города на протяжении многих столетий.
In fact, Kontraktova Ploshcha, or square, actually got its name thanks to the auctions that were held regularly here since the late 18th century. According to a decree issued by the Tsar, the fair, which had been held before that every winter in Volhynia, was moved to Kyiv. And since then it has gathered up to 5,000 guests every year. Swedes, English, Italians and Greeks were permanent participants of the fair. At that time, Kontraktova Fair gave an additional push to the city's development and became a stable source of income for town folk. During the contracts period, Podil turned into a kind of huge hotel, where every free corner was rented out to visitors. But there's little left from that very merchant-like Podil after the terrible fire that raged in 1811. Podil was almost completely burnt to the ground. It was, after all, wooden, and it was rebuilt again in the 19th century. The streets were designed again in the spirit of that era. The buildings were erected in the style of classicism. Kyiv's Podil, just like a phoenix, rose from the ashes. It was as if someone turned the next page and began to write its story from scratch. This is how its story has come to our era. It received its logical continuation in the 1960s. After all, this was when the subway system came to Podil.
Він вийшов з гори, зайшов на Поштовій площі і далі рухався прямо по центру гостинного двору.
It moved out of the hills into Poshtova Square and then moved straight, right into the heart of Hostinny Dvir, which is also called Guest House. The tunnel passes under Hostinny Dvir. It was a very tricky engineering situation because back then, Hostinny Dvir was still in its original form, the way it was built in the early 19th century, not completed and one story. The tunnel passed under it, and then in the part where Spaska Street goes to Horiv Street, then Verkhny Val Street, then Nizhny Val Street, and then to Shevchenko. It was all broken through. That is, the buildings beyond this territory were demolished.
Тобто знесені будівлі за межі цієї території.
The missing parts of Podil history were not known until the future subway route unveiled them. The construction of the second subway line, the blue one, in the 1970s was monitored by the whole country. The city in the area of Kontraktova Square and surrounding streets became an archaeological excavation zone. And the findings explored back then by Kyiv scientists became a real sensation.
Был обнаружен ряд очень ценных находок.
A number of very valuable finds have been discovered by archaeologists. This meant that, among other things, the unveiling of the subway was delayed by almost a year. Because at first, archaeologists dug when the builders carried out their work, examined, preserved, discovered artifacts, and then took them to the Piroghiv National Museum near Kyiv. Various work tools were found, including ancient weapons and many other artifacts.
Там оружие древнего, ну и многие другие артефакты.
Kontraktova Ploshcha station was launched on December 17, 1976. Initially, it was named Red Square. It existed with this name until it was renamed in 1990. The station has an extensive network of underground crosswalks that connect nearby streets to the central square. The large underground hall, with its two exits to the city, is lined with abrasion-resistant gray granite and pink marble, as if in continuation of the good tradition of past architects, the creators of Kyiv stone masterpieces.
Довольно лаконичный образ.
It's quite a concise image. It is in part devoted to the historical part of Podil and partly to the Kyiv Mohyla Academy. There is even embossed work over one of the aisles on the platform that's quite interesting.
Довольно интересная. Вот. В основном ее образ.
Basically, its appearance has almost not changed at all. This is one of the stations that quite closely resembles its original form. Back then, it had a progressive construction, increased pitch in the columns, which made it more spacious, and not quite standard design was used. These columns were made of steel and not out of reinforced concrete in order to increase the pitch of the columns.
Использовать железобетонные, а там они были стальные для того, чтобы именно увеличить шаг колонн.
All the construction stage, the main task of designers and subway builders was laying the route with minimal losses. The issue here was urban development, and of course it was tied to the entire historical past of Podil. Those archaeological treasures that were discovered from the first days of underground work in the area of Kontraktova Square.
Перший був плацдарм, який вдалося, він був розкритий повністю екскаватором. І в результаті цього
It was the first springboard from which it all began. It was opened completely by an excavator.
які лежали на глибині.
The result was that the lowest horizons of Podil were opened, at a depth of 8 to 12 meters. It was the most interesting and original story. And I discovered it when the first part of the works had already been carried out. I began working there in 1972. We were opening the top layer.
Другому, і ми верхні яруси, тобто почали знизу, а перейшли до верху.
We began from the bottom and moved to the top. This also attracted television, and newspapers began to actively write about it. And then Moscow correspondents appeared in Kyiv. And all this was presented as such a powerful discovery. On one occasion, I said that the popularity of archaeology was equal to that of Dynamo Kyiv.
Дорівнювала популярності київського «Динамо».
The territory of Kontraktova Square as a powerful tourist and cultural center of Kyiv was determined as early as 1966. The attractiveness of Old Podil was evaluated by the Soviet authorities. The potential tourist flows of this entire historical space were calculated. And during the era of the Khrushchev thaw, the attitude towards architectural heritage changed radically. That's why the construction of the underground in this part of Kyiv was conducted with extreme caution.
Углы обошли, к сожалению, не все острые. Так или иначе, часть сооружений пошла под снос, в частности, на Почтовой площади.
Unfortunately, not all the sharp corners were bypassed. Some of the structures had to be demolished. In particular, on Pochtova Square, behind Kontraktova towards Taras Shevchenko, a number of buildings were demolished there.
Закрытым способом. Ну, то есть, котлован.
Many houses survived because, first of all, construction was carried out between Poshtova and Kontraktova in a closed way, just underground. Second, soil freezing was used, and this meant underground areas during construction, and those buildings on the street were protected.
Находились здания на самой улице.
This greatly increased the cost of construction, but it was worth it. Sahaidachny Street, Zhdanov Street back then has hardly changed. The subway route was underneath it, without breaking the integrity of the buildings. And on Kontraktova Square, Red Square back then, amazing discoveries were made that wrote new pages in the history of Kyiv and Rus.
Когда прокладывалась сама линия метрополитена, на Контрактовой площади открыто было.
When this subway line was laid, a whole community of nearby neighborhoods was opened on Kontraktova Square. And the idea arose, even published as a sketch design, and presented to the authorities for consideration. The idea of creating that version, which is widely used in many countries today. People go up to the platform and then would be surrounded by a medieval city behind transparent glass walls.
Их бы окружал средневековый город за стеклянными прозрачными стенами.
The author of this revolutionary idea in the late 1960s was Kyiv architect Avram Miletsky. Back then, the issue was how to organize the historical, archaeological, and architectural ancient Kyiv Park Museum. A detailed design of the City of Craftsmen was developed later on. There was a proposal to turn some of the streets in Podil into a kind of handicraft quarter, so artists and folk craftsmen could draw paintings, make pottery, forge iron, make wood carvings, and even bake bread right in front of tourists. The color of Podil's artisan past is in part expressed today by Andreevsky descent, the popular street for tourists, and the not so long ago opened Peyzajna alley. The ambitious project never saw the light of day. The reasons for this included it being an untimely idea and lacking relevance.
Очевидно, всіх задовольнив, мається на увазі.
It seems that our leaders were satisfied with this version back then, and separate underground expositions were not created. Bulgaria was already working on this idea back then, and Greece began getting packed with such expositions.
Почали над цим працювати. Вся Греція почала заповнюватись такими експозиціями. В Європі, в Кольні над цей період.
And a huge underground complex appears in the European city of Cologne, while it's now become some kind of shtick.
Я вже читаю постійно.
There are many such expositions even in South Korea today. It became such a new thing, a presentation for world archaeology.
Новою фішкою для світової археологічної взагалі презентації.
The older the city, the greater the number of pages in its history, and archaeologists should dig deeper to tell their contemporaries what life was really like on the banks of the Dnipro River. The phenomenon of Podil has shown with vivid colors since the 1970s. Today we can even say not least thanks to the Kyiv subway, and ironically thanks to neglect of the law on the protection of monuments at that time. After all, serious archaeological research had to be carried out before starting this project, and the underground route could well have gone in another direction, thereby leaving behind the secret past of Kyiv for a very long time. The doors are closing. Next station,